Morning broke on 9 April 1940 like any other day for many along Norway's long coastline. The sea was silent. The fjord slept under a gray sky. People stirred in small houses, unaware how close war had crept. At 05:15, what the invaders called Wesertzeit, warships glided into the harbors of major Norwegian towns. At the same hour, another arm of the attack struck. Paratroopers landed on airfields near Oslo and Stavanger. It was swift, almost silent, but from that moment, Norway's neutrality ended. In Copenhagen and across Denmark the same day, German forces marched in, and the Danish government yielded in hours. The shock was sudden, but in Norway, resistance flickered. Soldiers, officials, and ordinary people struggled to realize what was happening. Cities along the coast, from Narvik in the far north to Oslo in the south, faced fear, confusion, the silent shape of invasion closing over them. For many Norwegians that dawn felt like the end of safety. A world they knew, home, trade, quiet fjords, peaceful mornings, was gone before they could fully wake. And yet, in the shock and silence, a question hovered. Could anyone stop what was coming? The wind was cold, steel wheels spun on quiet roads long before guns ever cracked. Somewhere in Europe, a lonely cyclist, not a cavalryman on a horse, perched atop a simple two-wheel frame, eyes alert, boots steady on the pedals. Bicycles, by the late 19th century, had already begun to creep into military thinking. They were cheaper than horses, easier to maintain, and could carry a man, often with some gear, over long distances without the noise, expense, and care that horses demanded. By 1900, armies across Europe had started to build cycler detachments. In France, every infantry and chasseur battalion carried a cyclist detachment. Italy's famous light infantry troops, the bersaglieri, began using folding bikes from the 1890s onward. Other armies in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Russia, even as far as the United States, experimented with bicycles for reconnaissance, dispatches, scouting, or rapid movement of foot soldiers. The strengths were clear. On smooth roads or decent tracks, a bicycle-mounted soldier could cover far more ground than a marching infantryman. Messages, orders, supplies could move quickly. Riders retained most of their energy. They could dismount and fight as ordinary infantry. Because of their relative simplicity, these units did not require the logistical burden that horses did. No fodder, no stables, no constant care. For many countries, this meant easier deployment, lower cost, and a surprisingly effective boost of mobility. So the bicycle, modest, silent, almost humble, slowly reimagined what an army could be. Not just horsemen or foot soldiers, but riders on steel wheels. Under the gray dawn or along dusty roads, armies would ride lightly, yet their presence when the time came could be heavy. There lay the seed of something new, wheels under helmets instead of hooves. And when war came, those wheels could make all the difference. There was a time when war wore the quiet ring of rubber on asphalt more than the thunder of engines. In 1914, as Europe descended into total war for the first time, armies fielded entire cyclist units, light infantry, messengers, scouts, often riding two-wheeled frames instead of marching on foot or charging on horseback. In Western Europe, before trench warfare locked the front, these bicycle-mounted troops moved quickly across the flatlands of Belgium, France, and beyond. Companies from armies like Germany, Belgium, Britain rode cycles to deliver messages, carry supplies, or scout ahead. In some armies, for instance the light infantry detachments of the Italian bersaglieri, folding bicycles had been adopted as early as the 1890s, giving them a mobility edge without costly maintenance that horses demanded. By the end of the First World War, many nations had come to see bicycles not just as oddities, but as useful tools of movement and communication, even though trench warfare soon turned the battlefield into muddy, static hell where two-wheelers had little role. Yet when war spread beyond Europe, the humble bicycle found new chance under different skies. In Asia, during the campaign that began on 8th of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, used bicycle infantry to storm through dense jungle, villages, and narrow roads. Entire units, light, silent, and supplied, pedaled through plantation tracks, jungle trails, local paths. They abandoned the need for horses or vehicles, so they didn't depend on fuel, fodder, or big supply lines. As the IJA troops advanced, they moved faster than Allied forces expected. Often they appeared where no one had expected them, behind defenses cutting off retreats, using the surprise of speed to disorient the enemy. In that moment, in Europe earlier, in jungles later, bicycles stopped being mere machines. They became tools of war, silent riders on two wheels reshaping how armies moved, how wars unfolded. But despite these daring uses, the success depended heavily on terrain, tactics, and the limits of what a bicycle infantry could carry. In open fields or on paved roads, they could race ahead. In deep forests, trenches, or against armored units, their advantage diminished. And even as they pedaled boldly across continents, from European farmlands to Asian jungles, the bicycle infantry remained, in many ways, a shadowy footnote to the roaring machines of modern war. The morning was still when the first German warship slid into Norwegian ports, not with sirens or warning, but carrying men whose boots would soon echo on quiet coastal streets. At 05:15 a.m., under the code Operation Veserubung, a vast invasion began. Across Norway's long coastline, from Narvik in the north down to Oslo in the southern ports, the enemy struck almost together. Naval landings, airborne assaults on airfields near Oslo and Stavanger, paratroopers seizing control, ships unloading troops far from expectation. Within hours, the calm was broken. In one of those early moves, the small port town of Arendal saw a landing of bicycle troops aboard the torpedo boat Greif. With no organized Norwegian resistance, the troops took the town, the goal to cut the undersea telegraph cable linking Norway with the United Kingdom. That landing marked one of the first footholds of the invasion. Farther along the coast, at Egersund, another bicycle infantry squadron landed. Again, resistance was minimal. The Germans seized the town and captured local naval and army forces. Their objective, sever communications, isolate Norway from outside help, and open the way for swift control. Within hours, major Norwegian ports, the icy harbor at Narvik, the fjords of Trondheim and Bergen, the capital's harbor at Oslo, were in German hands. Paratroopers at airfields, warships at sea, bicycle troops on land. Germany's strategy was a synchronized blow, striking sea, sky, and land before Norway could even mount a coordinated defense. For many Norwegians, dawn of that day was the moment safety cracked open. Houses, fjords, the familiar coast, all swept under the shadow of foreign boots. The suddenness, the scale, the precision. It was war, arriving by surprise, on ships, in the air, and on the ground, under pedal and steel. And somewhere in that morning silence, people must have whispered, "How could this be happening? Right here? Right now?" The roads along Norway's coast in April 1940 felt narrow and unfinished, curling between dark pine forests and steep hills. Anyone who has walked them knows the sound there, a quiet scrape of gravel, the echo of boots, the way the wind carries every noise. On those roads, heavy machines struggled, but bicycles moved like ghosts. Germany understood this before the invasion began. Operation Veserubung depended on speed, on landing troops who could fan out immediately, seize telegraph stations, police posts, rail lines, and choke points before the Norwegian army could gather itself. The bicycle infantry assigned to early landings in towns like Arendal and Egersund were chosen for that very reason. Light, fast, silent, and able to cover ground where vehicles would choke. In Arendal, where the torpedo boat Greif arrived early on 9 April, the bicycle troops stepped off, mounted quickly, and pushed inland to secure the telegraph link. No firefight, no delay. The mission was clear: cut Norway's connection to Britain. Their mobility made that possible within minutes of landing. Egersund saw the same pattern. The landing force included bicycle-mounted soldiers whose task was to capture the vital telegraph station that connected Norway to the outside world. Once on shore, they pedaled through the small town, encountering almost no resistance, and took control before most residents had realized anything was wrong. Their presence closed another door to Allied help. Norway's geography only amplified their advantage. The country's interior roads were not built for armored vehicles. Many were single-lane strips carved along cliffsides. Spring snow still lingered in places. Fuel lines for trucks or motorcycles were unreliable during rapid landings, and German planners knew they could not afford stalled units during the first hours of the invasion. A bicycle, though, needed no fuel. A soldier could ride uphill, carry his bike across patches of snow, or roll silently into a village without announcing himself. The Germans leaned heavily on that silence. In towns with small garrisons or no troops at all, resistance officers sometimes learned of the invasion only when a handful of strangers on bicycles appeared at their door, rifles slung across their backs. The psychological effect carried weight. Locals had expected that any invading army would arrive with tanks, engines, and thunder. Instead, men on bicycles slipped through their streets, calm, purposeful, unsettling in their quiet confidence. It signaled that the enemy was already deep inside the country before most people had time to gather a defense. Even Norwegian officers admitted later that the speed of those first landings made coordination almost impossible. Telephones were cut. Telegraph lines went dead. Orders to mobilize came slowly, or not at all. Bicycle units were not the largest force Germany used, but they became the sharp edge of early disruption, fast enough to scatter communication, light enough to move where machines could not. Yet there was something more subtle beneath their success, something almost eerie. These soldiers, riding machines that looked harmless in peacetime, turned everyday roads into tools of control. A quiet wheel over gravel might decide whether a town kept its voice or lost it. And as the first day of the invasion unfolded, people across Norway began hearing the same thing. Not the roar of engines, but the faint roll of spokes cutting into cold morning air, a sound that carried farther than anyone expected. It was only the beginning, and the silence itself felt like a warning, still waiting to reveal its full weight. There's a certain kind of story that spreads easily in wartime, the kind told in dim rooms, whispered over kitchen tables, or added to memories years later. In Norway, one of those stories claimed that German bicycle commandos stormed great fortresses, pedaling straight into gunfire and taking strongholds through sheer surprise. It sounds dramatic, it feels cinematic, but the records, the ones written on the day, not decades later, paint a quieter, stranger picture. When historians combed through the operations of 9 April 1940, they found real bicycle landings in Arendal and Egersund. Those are confirmed, documented, and unambiguous. Both towns fell quickly, but neither had major fortifications. The German goal was communication control, not fortress assault. As for Norway's true strongpoints, places like Oscarsborg Fortress guarding Oslofjord, the story was far different. Oscarsborg did not fall to bicycle troops or commando cyclists. It fired deadly shots at the German cruiser Blücher at dawn on 9th April, sinking it in the fjord and delaying the German advance toward Oslo. That defense came from coastal artillery and torpedo batteries, not from anything involving two-wheeled attackers. Historical accounts make no mention of bicycle-mounted forces taking part in that clash, nor in the fortress's eventual surrender later in April. Other Norwegian fortresses, Hegra, Kvarven, and the small positions scattered along narrow valleys, were overwhelmed by air power, artillery, or infantry assaults supported by naval forces. No reliable record shows bicycle infantry breaking through gates or storming walls. The myth likely grew because bicycle troops appeared suddenly in several towns, giving the impression of a stealthy commando-like force. But their real accomplishments lay in speed and communication disruption, not in dramatic fortress attacks. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Japanese bicycle infantry truly did roll through positions that British commanders once believed secure. But again, not in the way legends suggest. In Malaya, the Imperial Japanese Army used bicycles to bypass defenses, not smash them head-on. They slipped around roadblocks, used jungle tracks, and appeared behind Allied lines faster than expected. That mobility helped lead to the collapse of defensive positions across the peninsula, eventually tightening the noose around the island fortress of Singapore. So the truth sits somewhere quieter than the myth. Bicycles were tools of speed, stealth, and surprise, not battering rams against stone walls. They changed the tempo of the first days in Norway and later reshaped the advance through Malaya. But they did not storm great gates or topple fortresses in a single rush. Still, myths survive for a reason. Somewhere inside them lies a human need to make sense of shock, to give chaos a sharper outline. And in that April confusion, when the enemy seemed to appear out of thin air, it was easy to believe that bicycles had carried them straight through walls. What mattered most, though, was the silence those wheels carried, and the way silence can distort memory long after the fighting ends. Dawn of invasion had passed. The quiet villages of coastal Norway, once waking to church bells, fishermen hauling nets, children calling down the docks, now woke to foreign flags, unfamiliar boots, and the slow hum of an occupation settling in. In the days and weeks after 9 April 1940, as the tide of war rolled through, the effects for ordinary people came fast. Towns once peaceful saw their fate shift, communications cut, normal trade disrupted, fear of violence creeping in. Many found themselves under a foreign rule they neither asked for nor expected. Fighting during the Norwegian campaign left its mark: military losses, civilian casualties, and deep scars on communities. On the Norwegian and Allied side, roughly 1,500 soldiers became casualties, among them around 860 killed. Civilians were not spared. About 400 Norwegian non-combatants lost their lives, many in bombing raids. Others fell in summary executions during chaotic fights in some regions. For many towns, even those initially captured peacefully by bicycle troops, like Egersund, the shock came slowly. First calm, then panic. Rumors of looming bombings, fear of reprisals, or violence forced some families to flee under uncertain skies. For soldiers of the invading forces, the war was not always swift victory. The German Navy, for instance, suffered heavily. Crews lost at sea. Ships sunk or damaged in attempts to dominate Norwegian waters. Beyond the immediate deaths and destruction, the occupation that followed brought deep, slow-burning consequences. With the government in exile and a puppet administration installed at home, the ordinary rhythms of Norwegian civic life, schools, local governance, trade, free speech, were disrupted or replaced. Some people lived under fear. Some watched neighbors disappear. Others endured the quiet, the absolute normality slowly bending around foreign boots. For many children that spring, home would never feel quite the same. And as the foreign flag was hoisted over familiar rooftops, a heavier truth settled. The war did not always arrive with roaring guns. Sometimes it came on soft rubber tires, quiet footsteps, and the weight of silence turning towns into occupied places. For years. There was a humid dawn on 8th of December 1941, when thousands of soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, landed on beaches in southern Thailand and northern Malaya. Their weapons were rifles, but their wheels were bicycles. From there began one of the swiftest advances the region had ever seen. These men, often unfamiliar with jungle heat, pedaled down plantation tracks, small roads, village paths. They carried gear, supplies, even radios, silently, quickly. The decision to use bicycles instead of horses or heavy vehicles mattered. In dense jungle, narrow roads, or muddy tracks, bicycles offered a speed and flexibility that heavier machines could never match. They moved south, bypassing main roads, slipping behind Allied defender lines. Because the terrain and infrastructure in Malaya made it difficult for tanks and trucks, bridges collapsed or destroyed by retreating defenders, the IJA's bicycle infantry often advanced miles ahead, cutting communications, surrounding defenders, and striking where least expected. In one stretch, the enemy retreated slowly, but the Japanese came faster, riding through jungles and villages. By the time defenders realized what was happening, their fallback plans were collapsing. That speed helped topple defenses across Malaya. When they reached Singapore, the city many assumed would hold as a fortress, the Japanese attack came not just from sea or air, but from land, from unexpected roads and paths. Bicycle-borne infantry, backed by their air and naval support, pressed the assault. The defenders, unprepared for that kind of mobility through jungle and roads, found their defenses collapsing fast. It was a different kind of war, not thunderous and slow, but quiet and fast, like wheels spinning in dark. Bicycles helped break illusions of safety. And by February 1942, a sprawling jungle peninsula and a fortress island had fallen. In that fall, the simple bicycle, humble every day, was transformed. It carried not farmers or merchants, but soldiers. It carried not goods, but fear. And it carried a future neither defenders nor civilians had truly seen coming. Picture a narrow road at dusk, the kind where the light fades fast and the air hangs still. A single rider pushes forward, the soft click of his chain the only sound. It's a simple image, but it carries a truth armies learned the hard way. Sometimes the smallest tools can reshape the pace of a battle, and sometimes they can't carry the weight war demands. Bicycles worked where movement mattered more than firepower. In Norway, landing forces used them to seize telegraph lines and choke points before defenders could organize. Light wheels meant no fuel, no engines, no heavy logistics. A soldier could roll for miles, dismount, and fight as infantry. That mobility, the ability to appear suddenly in places defenders thought safe, gave bicycle troops an early advantage. In Malaya, the lesson was even sharper. The Imperial Japanese Army covered ground at a pace British commanders hadn't imagined possible. When bridges were blown, riders carried their bicycles over girders or pushed them through rivers. When roads narrowed to trails, they kept going. Speed broke the defenders' rhythm. Surprise eroded morale. In that setting, bicycles weren't just useful, they were decisive. But the weaknesses were just as real. A bicycle can't charge a fortified line. It can't haul heavy weapons. It buckles under artillery fire just as easily as a man on foot. In Norway, as fighting moved inland and rough terrain tightened, bicycle units lost momentum. Harsh weather, steep roads, and resistance in mountain passes reminded planners that wheels alone couldn't carry an army through every landscape. In Malaya, bicycles helped troops advance, but they didn't win battles by themselves. Japanese successes depended on air superiority, coordinated infantry attacks, tight supplies, and British miscalculations. The bicycles amplified those factors, but they didn't replace them. There's a tendency, years later, to romanticize unusual tools, to say a war was won on two wheels, or that a simple frame of steel changed history. The truth is softer, more grounded. Bicycles were force multipliers, not miracle weapons. They worked best when combined with planning, surprise, and terrain that favored them. And they failed when battles slowed, when firepower mattered more than movement, or when the land itself pushed back. Yet there's something unmistakable about the way they linger in memory. Maybe it's because bicycles feel familiar. Maybe it's the quietness, the notion that a machine so ordinary could play a part in moments so violent. And just as the spokes turned under tired legs in Europe's cold mornings or Malaya's heavy heat, the question remained hanging in the air. How far could a simple tool carry an army before the world demanded something heavier? There's a certain quiet that settles after war, not the silence of peace, but something heavier, like the air right after a long storm. People walk the same roads, hear the same gulls over harbors, or the same cicadas in distant jungles, yet nothing feels quite like it once did. Those who lived through 1940 in Norway, or 1941 to 42 in Malaya, carried that kind of quiet inside them for years. If you ask the older generations, the ones who stood on docks, hid in basements, or watched columns of tired soldiers pass their homes, they often remember the strangest details. Not just gunfire or uniforms, but small things. A bicycle leaning against a wall, the shadow of a soldier pedaling at dusk, the uneasy calm of a street where no engines growled. For Norwegians, those early April days left a mark that lasted long after the occupation began. A simple two-wheeled machine had helped strangers cut lines, take towns, slip through familiar places with alarming ease. It wasn't the might of tanks or the roar of aircraft that reached them first. It was the soft roll of rubber on wet roads. That memory stayed with many, especially in small coastal towns, where life had once moved slowly and safely. For people in Malaya, the memory carried a different heat. The thick jungle air, the smell of burned fuel from bombed airfields, the unbelievable pace at which the front moved south. Some remember watching riders appear on roads that defenders swore were impossible to traverse. Others recall how bicycles piled up outside commandeered houses, the frames dented, the spokes bent from weeks of nonstop movement. For civilians, it was the moment they realized that the war was no longer distant. It had arrived on their streets, sudden and unstoppable. What ties these memories together isn't the machine itself. It's the reminder that war doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through tools so ordinary that they blend into the world until it's too late to react. A bicycle, an everyday object, became part of something that changed lives, families, towns. And beyond the military lessons, there's a human one. History isn't always shaped by the biggest weapons. Sometimes it's shaped by whatever a soldier can push forward. A rifle, a pack, a steel frame with pedals. Ordinary things placed in extraordinary moments. People who lived through those times often say the same thing in their own words. Life can change in a single morning under a sky that looks just like any other. Roads you walked every day can turn into passages for someone else's purpose. And something as familiar as a bicycle can carry fear, hope, escape, or loss, depending on who rides it and why. Even now, when most of those riders are long gone, their wheels still echo in the stories told by children, grandchildren, and the history written after the dust settled, not because bicycles won wars, but because they revealed how fragile normal life can be, and how quickly it can be taken. And somewhere in that echo, in the soft memory of spokes turning under a gray sky or a humid dawn, there's a quiet reminder. The tools of war may change, but the people who feel its weight carry those sounds with them for the rest of their lives.